My name is Adam Charles Hart. I'm a visiting researcher at the Pitt Libraries, and I write about a lot of stuff in film and media. My first book on horror, film, TV, games, and other kinds of media came out last year. And I'm currently at work on two books, one on a history of handheld cinematography and one on the work of George A. Romero. At the library system, we have George's archives, which are unique in that although he produced, depending how you count, 17 feature films, or he directed 17 feature films in his career, that's not fully indicative of just how prolific he was. There are literally hundreds of drafts of unproduced screenplays in the archive. And after processing them, I've been reading them. And so this is a project that tries to take into account all the films that George Romero didn't get to make because he kind of had that zombie movie albatross hanging around his neck from the very beginning of his career.
Yeah, he almost got typecast as a director.
Oh, he
Yeah,
genuinely got typecast.
very much.
Like the archive, he was realistic. There's a lot of horror and horror related stuff in here. Like he knew that's what he was going to be able to get funded. But there's a bunch of other stuff, children's movies, fantasies, like, like fantasy movies, a lot of science fiction stuff, some like satires or just kind of like dramas. His interest, there's a few westerns, like his interests were really broad, and like he made mostly zombie films because that's what could get funded. So
Yeah,
like one of the things about this project is that like it's sort of approaching George as an artist and asking, well, just because a bunch of guys in suits would only fund his zombie movies, why should we let that limit our understanding of who he was and the kind of writing that he did and art that he produced? It's fun. He's a really good writer. It's fun to read this stuff.
do you see any future of any of those scripts actually getting produced?
Well, one of them is currently being produced for Netflix. It's a Stephen King adaptation called The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon.
Oh, they're doing Tom Gordon. Okay.
Yeah. So George loved it from the very beginning, and he and Stephen King started corresponding about it basically as soon as it was published. And so I think our first Tom Gordon script is from 1999.
Wow.
So it's, been something that he and then his former wife, Christine Romero, were working on at various stages for 20 years. And it seems like it's finally getting made with Len Ramsey as the director.
Okay.
Um, and she's one of my favorite filmmakers. She's fantastic and just like a perfect fit for the material too.
Very cool.
It's very atmospheric and, kind of surreal-ish. And yeah, I'm very excited for it.
That sounds great. I will definitely be keeping my eyes out for that then. So taking it back to a bit more of a general sort of thing, what was the first movie, book, game, whatever that really kind of got you into horror?
That got me into horror. Um, it may be The Exorcist. I was like, I was in college when it was re-released with new footage. I think it was released as the version you've never seen before. Um, and I just remember seeing it and being utterly traumatized by it. Like it was the scariest thing that I'd ever seen. And I saw it, more than that, I saw it at a midnight screening and had to like walk home alone back to my dorm, uh, across an abandoned campus at like 3 in the morning, because it's a very long movie, um, to a building that was at the time, for whatever reason, like mostly uninhabited. So like I just basically had to spend the entire night watching cartoons until I could finally feel comfortable enough to fall asleep. Um, but the thing about that was that this movie, was so traumatizingly scary that it really made me curious how something that I know is just a movie could have that much of an effect on me. And so, as much as anything, like that experience kind of sent me down the road of trying to analyze, like, what makes horror scary and why the hell would we subject ourselves to such an unpleasant experience as, you know, like screaming in the dark at, you know, the devil attacking little girls and, everything else that happens in that movie. Yeah.
There's certainly a lot that happens in that movie. A lot of
Yeah.
people seem to credit that as like the scariest movie ever made, or at least the scariest one they've ever seen. I know my dad is included in that list of like just refused to ever watch it again because it was so traumatizing. Would you say that's like the scariest movie you've ever seen?
I think that was the most scared I've ever been at a
Yeah.
movie. Um, I it's hard defining exactly what scared means. Okay, so watching The Descent, this would have been a couple of years after The Exorcist. I was also scared out of my mind in that one, in part because um, it's about a group of women spelunkers who go underground in some like uncharted rural cave system. And before anything scary in a horror movie sense happens, they're wriggling through like tiny caves um, underground and not knowing where they're going exactly. And it's just like the claustrophobia that it invoked in me. Like I didn't know that I was claustrophobic until I saw that movie. And so like when horror movie stuff started happening, it was almost a relief. Like at least they're not in the caves anymore. I mean, they're still in the caves, but at least they're not in that little,
I had that issue watching As Above, So Below because I am definitely claustrophobic, and so that one was not easy for me to watch. I
Yeah.
loved it, but if that's what The Descent is like, I may hold back on that one a bit. I may just
Um,
watch it in a room that's very open so I don't feel stuck.
well, yeah, you may need to, put yourself through that ordeal in a well-lit room with, some people like patting you on the back as you watch it and whatever else. But yeah, that was a particularly, traumatizing viewing experience as well. Um, and, you know, like I'm just generally curious when it comes to horror, like sort of two main questions. Like, why is something scary and why do we subject ourselves to it? But the idea of scary doesn't just mean like that something bad will happen. Because, like there's plenty of action movies or a gangster movie where somebody walks in with a machine gun and like mows down a bunch of people. There's plenty of like science fiction movies or comic book movies where thousands or millions or billions of people die. A planet gets destroyed or whatever. Um, like those are bigger body counts than some slasher movie about a guy with a knife and a mask. But only one of those movies gives us nightmares. And so there's something irrational or not understandable or inconceivable about the kinds of fear that horror deals in. and that's what I'm interested in, and I think that that's kind of directly related to why we subject ourselves to them, because these are things that we don't understand and we kind of want to work through them.
Mhm.
um whatever deep deep recesses of our psyches are being probed by the guy in the mask or the possessed little girl, or you know a Victorian ghost browsing the stacks at the New York Public Library.
Yeah.
um, whatever whatever hidden things in the back of our brains that's tapping into, um, is, I think, something that we feel a need to explore, a curiosity about, a desire to work through. And like it kind of comes down to some pretty morbid stuff. Like the thing about horror movies, like the reason why uh, death in a horror movie feels different from death in a gangster movie or an action movie is that like you really feel it. You really feel the consequences of death, which is, kind of exactly the sort of um, uh, opposite of what the reputation of horror is, which is that like it's, you know, violence pornography. The implication amongst people with, good taste, is always that the only reason you could like horror movies is because you're a pervert. Um, and I really don't think that's correct. I think that the reason that you like horror movies is because, like, it does make you scared. Like, and you're scared because, like, human life means something. And you're forced to reckon with what it means for not just a human life to end, but like for your own human life to end. Um, I think that horror movies get into some pretty heady spaces, even if it's just, um, a rubber mask that looks like a decaying corpse that's trying to, take a bite out of your arm or something like that. Um, I think that's at the base of horror films' appeal, its popularity. Um,
So you're primarily interested in what scares people and then why we subject to them, or why people subject themselves to this sort of fear. Is that what most horror research kind of focuses on, or what is horror research sort of look at broadly, and kind of where does it start? Because it's such a long genre across several medium.
you know, the horror genre itself is relatively new in the scheme of things. Um, as we currently understand it, like the horror genre really sort of requires like the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution in order for ghosts to be a thing that like violates our rational understanding of the universe. Like there have always been ghosts, there's always been creatures and monsters and all of that. Um, but it was, sort of part of the mythology, part of the like folkloric understanding of how things work. And even if somebody believe in, you know, did not believe in vampires or whatever, um, there wasn't that same sort of sense of inconceivability or violation. Um, and so it's in the 19th century that you start to get ghost stories, but also Frankenstein and stories about vampires and stories about, witches and um, other kinds of horror monsters, for which what's horrifying about them is not just that they can kill you, but that they don't fit into the scientific understanding of the universe. Um, that they're completely like outside of the human realm of understanding, basically. Um, and so like it's it's a kind of marginal genre in the 19th century that comes to the forefront in the 20th century, but always as a kind of like, you know, somewhat disreputable thing, with a few peaks in both popularity and sort of mainstream acceptance, um, that are not entirely, but sort of largely tied up with movies. So when you have Dracula and Frankenstein come out in the early 1930s, like those are gigantic hits, and they come out one right after the other. They, are extremely well received. Karloff and Lugosi become celebrities. They're almost immediately acknowledged as classics. But then, as much as that establishes the genre as something that will continue, like basically from then on, um, there's nothing that reaches that level of cultural impact, for decades, really. And increasingly, horror becomes associated with sequels and like very unconvincing monsters, guys in rubber gorilla suits. And like by the 1950s, it's primarily a genre made for kids in the public imagination. um not something that like respectable critics would write about.
Mhm.
So it's really not until the 1970s that that starts to change. There's a couple of things written before then that are incredibly intelligent dissections of the genre that sort of look at how monsters can be representative of cultural anxieties,
Mhm.
so that our monsters tell us about what a society is afraid of.
Mhm.
And like spoiler alert, it's usually minorities, foreigners, gay people, women, others. um, it's pretty consistent, actually. Um, but it's in the 1970s that a more sort of rigorously theoretical approach starts to develop, associated mainly with one writer, a Canadian critic named Robin Wood, who sees in the independent films of the era, starting with Night of the Living Dead, but including the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Last House on the Left, the early films of John Carpenter and other, young horror auteurs of the era, a new era of horror in which there's an incredibly not just vivid but visceral political project. So he sees horror as being in its sort of like ideal form, this kind of transgressive genre that mounts an attack on the system. The repressive, oppressive system that seeks to exclude people who are different, um, is kind of literally and metaphorically attacked by Leatherface, by zombies, by, any number of, kind of like chaotic horror movie villains from the 1970s. And he starts to give it this sort of political inflection to the readings that was, largely missing from people's understanding of the genre until then. Like, because it was silly. It's guys in masks, and why would anybody take even this very good horror movie seriously? It's about somebody chasing after you, trying to kill you. Like, this is, but what he sees in it, in this sort of like political energy of it, is an encapsulation of the Vietnam era, in which living in the late 60s and 1970s, really sort of felt apocalyptic. There was violence on TV and around the world, and assassinations, and like political corruption at a scale that like had never really been acknowledged before, and all sorts of changes that were happening within the society that were scary to a lot of people, but that also just sort of suggested new possibilities. And so for Wood, really, the way to talk about that was not, a drama about the like experiences, the tragic experiences of a veteran. It was a horror movie that captured that apocalyptic feeling. Watching Night of the Living Dead felt like 1968 in a way that other movies made in 1968 that may have been more directly and explicitly about current events couldn't capture,
Mhm.
couldn't communicate. And so horror movies were a way to talk about the current time in a way that conveyed that to the audience.
Mhm.
And he saw that as valuable. And that sort of set the agenda for horror films in a lot of ways. That horror studies would be focused on the political and social analysis of the films.
So horror movies tend to be very transgressive, and they kind of challenge and analyze different ways in which society is kind of constructed and how we categorize different types of people. Would you say it's a progressive genre? There's been a pretty, I feel like, at least at the surface level, a kind of misogyny, especially within like the slasher genre. Is it like a progressive genre? Is it trying to push towards something better, or is it just playing on these sort of stereotypes, these like isms to kind of challenge them?
I mean, I think that it's ambivalently progressive, sort of inherently, because there is this subversion and transgression that I think is inscribed just into the basic form, you know, because it's disreputable. Watching a horror movie feels subversive, because it adheres to an entirely different set of aesthetics than a quote unquote good movie. Even something like a slasher film feels like transgressive in terms of watching it. But I think that most horror films, calling them progressive would be misunderstanding both what they're doing and the appeal of them. I think that the slasher cycle, which was in particular like something that Wood, hated. He one of the reasons he started writing so much about horror films is because he saw a trend starting with John Carpenter's Halloween, of what he called reactionary horror that he associated with the slasher film, where it's the people who misbehave who are being punished, marginalized people being marginalized further, through these kind of like spectacles of violence that were, you know at least at some level meant to enjoy. He thought that chaotic and radical or revolutionary energy of something like Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Night of the Living Dead was missing. But I think that the most interesting thing about the genre is that it always leaves some room for that sort of transgressive, subversive empathy. That the monster is this figure of outsiderdom, who is, demonized, like in a very as literal a sense as you can get it in some senses, in some cases. Um, but uh, that figure is also in some ways like, if not charismatic or sympathetic, then interesting and intriguing. So that even a figure like Jason from the Friday the 13th movies, who doesn't talk, doesn't really do much except swing that machete around, still has like, um, a massive fan base, or at least did at the time that there were, 1.5 million Friday the 13th movies coming out. Same with Michael Myers. And I don't think that we can simply limit our understanding of why there is that interest to, like, I want to see him kill women and whatever unfortunate minority character happens to wander into this movie. Um, but that said, like, that's an incredibly limited sort of political program. Like, there's, the in the 1980s in particular, all of movies, all of culture was kind of dominated by reactionary, right-wing streaks.
Mhm.
And so horror movies at least allow the possibility for alternatives, for other ways of understanding them. And, the like large fandom of slasher movies from women and queer people and minorities, in particular, Black audiences in the 1980s were like some of the most loyal audiences for, like Friday the 13th, the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. Um, what's really heartening and exciting about the genre is that in the last decade or so, um, not only has the genre began to speak more directly to those audiences, but that the people who are whose voices were excluded or marginalized within, the slasher film or previous cycles of horror are making their own.
Mhm.
And so, like, there's just this incredible flowering of, um, this incredible renewal of the genre, especially in literature, but it's obviously bled through into cinema, where, like, women writers and writers of color and queer writers are driving driving the concerns of the genre and, like, driving the fandoms as well, so that just like the makeup of the horror audience is changing. um and the thing is, like, it's really fantastic. Like, the work is so great. So much of horror is built around kind of regurgitating old formulas. And so this infusion of new voices and new perspectives is something that the genre has needed for a really long time. And, you know, I think that uh, it's just incredibly exciting. Um, you know, at the library, I've gotten to work in various capacities with a bunch of women writers and filmmakers for some stuff that I'm working on. And just, there's so much work coming out, and so much of it is so fantastic. And every time I talk to a writer, a woman writer, a filmmaker, I find out about some other woman writer or filmmaker whose work I did not know, and immediately go seek out and am also blown away by.
There's been a lot of, I guess, more mainstream attention on horror with the popularity of something like Get Out or Us or anything Jordan Peele has done.
Yeah.
Lovecraft Country on HBO. There's been, I think, some great focus back in the mainstream, but also in kind of uh, putting typically marginalized voices into a genre that I feel like has very commonly always put them in this sort of box. I mean, Lovecraft Country being pretty explicitly like offering its commentary like, hey, yeah, H.P. Lovecraft, one of the, like the influential names in horror, was also incredibly racist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic, every ism you can imagine. And so kind of reclaiming spaces within a genre that's so dominated by these sort of white male voices. And so it's been very good to see.
It's incredibly important to have these perspectives at the current moment because, you know, I think that Robin Wood was 100% correct about the sort of like new horror film that begins with Night of the Living Dead. Um, really capturing what it felt like to live under the Vietnam era. And I think that, Get Out and Us, and like the work of writers like Stephen Graham Jones and Emil Ferris, the work of these writers and filmmakers, some of whom are having like enormous amounts of success, like Jordan Peele, like Stephen Graham Jones, and some of whom are working in the just kind of like the relative anonymity of like modest success among genre fans, but whose work is still completely fantastic and wonderful. That they are capturing what it feels like to live in America today in a way that feels so vivid and visceral, and that I haven't been getting from mainstream horror films. There have been plenty of mainstream horror films that I've really liked, even loved over the last 5 years. But they don't seem to capture the current moment in the way that Jordan Peele can, in the way that Stephen Graham Jones can, or any number of other authors or filmmakers that I could name, who would not have been granted a platform 30 years ago. I'm incredibly excited for Nia DaCosta's Candyman
Yeah.
to finally come out. Like, it's not the biggest tragedy of the pandemic, but it's among the more frivolous ones. It's among the more frivolous tragedies. It's near the top, I suppose, because I think everybody just recognizes that this story, when told by a Black woman rather than a white German man who hasn't spent any time in the United States, or at least in Chicago, has a lot to say to the current moment. And we want that sort of engagement. Plus, it looks like it rules. So,
Yeah, I mean, that doesn't hurt. Yeah. So shifting gears a bit, you have one published book, as you said, Monstrous Forms, Moving Image Horror Across Media, covers the horror genre in several different ways, but also about your interest in sort of moving picture, how that looks in different sort of technical ways. One chapter that interests me pretty significantly is a whole chapter dedicated to the jump scare. They are typically seen as like the lowest form of horror. People hate jump scares, and a lot of people I've talked to have said they don't watch horror movies because they don't like jump scares. And I'm like, well, is it horror if it's just a jump scare? And so there's some debate about that. What can you say more about jump scares in general or about the book as a whole?
So the thing about the jump scare chapter is that to me, that's the like central chapter of the book. You know, that's sort of indicative of my project here, which is it's not about recuperating or redeeming horror movies, but it's about the ways in which horror movies don't, or horror media, you know, doesn't adhere to the rules of good taste.
Yeah.
And the jump scare goes against everything that is aesthetically proper. It's thought to be dumb. It's just like it's a dumb reflex. Like loud noise makes you scream. Like that's
It's cheap. It's a cheap scare.
yeah. I mean that's the most common epithet, right? Like it's cheap. So what I want to argue is not that like it's good or bad, but that we should understand it as creating a unique relationship to the screen. And that we shouldn't just understand it as like, oh, there was a cheap jump scare, but like, okay, I'm watching this movie and it attacked me, basically. Um, so when is it going to attack me again?
Mhm.
And more than that, like your reaction to a jump scare is something that's completely unique to the cinema. So it's one of my favorite things. Back when public gatherings were a thing and movie theaters were a thing, to go to any horror movie that's like even a little bit okay on opening night when there's kind of a crowd and there's a jump scare and some portion of the crowd screams or jumps or whatever, and then there's this interesting thing that happens, which is people start to chuckle. They like are laughing at themselves, they're laughing at their like pal or boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever who had the big reaction, and like it's surprisingly jovial and like friendly that like, oh yeah, ha 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 ha.
I know
We
you teach a horror class at Pitt that I've taken, and we watched Wreck, the uh, found footage. Is it Spanish?
yeah.
The
Yeah.
found footage Spanish movie, and there's a huge jump scare at the very end. And I know you actually recorded our class and then you showed that to us like the next day of like,
Yeah.
yeah, here is your reaction. And there was like all of us in the room, like these avid horror fans, all jumping back and then kind of laughing. But I remember that was a very like vocal movie for us where that was the one where we were reacting I think the most to it as we were watching the movie as compared to others where we were pretty quiet the whole time. That felt like very reminiscent of going and seeing a horror movie in theaters where we can actually like talk back to the screen.
um, but I mean, the thing is like that horror movies sort of encourage that sort of response because, you know, traditional or let's say conventional um, proper movie aesthetics sort of want you to forget that you're at a movie. You know, you become so wrapped up, you metaphorically enter into the world of the movie. Whereas horror movies, you know, particularly like sensational, like jump scary type ones or gory ones, they're basically like reaching out of the screen and slapping you in the face a bunch of times. You know, like they're making you aware that you're watching a movie by making you scream, and then like you're laughing at yourself because you're aware that it's just a it's just a damn movie. Like this isn't really like I'm not going to be killed by that large man who jumped out from behind that tiny tree. Where was he hiding? It's this kind of fun, almost game-like engagement with the audience. So again, the interesting thing is why would people subject themselves to that? And like think it's because it's fun.
Yeah.
You know, like it is fun to be scared in a way that like is reassuringly fake, right? You know, horror movies of that kind are commonly, um, you know, likened to a roller coaster ride, and I don't think that that's wrong, but I think that it's interesting that jump scares are associated with scary movies, like that they're two different ways of getting at the same thing, that the kind of like irrational fears of ghosts and goblins and men in masks or whatever, um, that then like getting that visceral jump and scream and sort of like self-awareness out of the audience is part of that experience. It's part of the way that we engage with these like deeper, you know, quote unquote, more substantial or more intellectual fears,
Mhm.
which a lot of people put in opposition with each other. Like it's either this or this. Like either it's atmospheric, you hear a lot. It's an atmospheric horror movie.
This
Uh,
atmospheric, it's a slow burn is
it's
another
a
one I put a
slow
lot.
burn. Um, but the thing is, like a lot of those movies are pretty visceral and physical too.
Mhm.
You know, The Shining has a couple of like I nobody would call them cheap because it's a movie from Stanley Kubrick, but like there's a couple of shocking, like sudden images in there that
It's
make you scream.
one of the shots in The Shining that I cannot get out of my head is just the really intense zoom in on the man in the dog suit. Some I don't know what it is about those types of zooms that just sit wrong with me, but especially in The Shining, that is just
Yeah,
one of those things that I cannot get out of my head, and it just screws with me.
yeah,
That's just like one shot that like I'll always remember from a horror movie.
yeah. No, there's a lot of shots like that from The Shining that will, you know, which is a movie that I'm pretty sure, because it's not particularly like gory, that most people see like a couple years too early.
Yeah, it
It's
was
like it's
my
not
first.
gory and it has a little kid as the hero, so it kind of feels like, oh, I'm curious about horror. Maybe I should watch, what's this? The Shining?
Oh,
Okay.
I was like, oh, this one's considered like one of the quintessentials of the genre, and then it's also
Yeah.
one of the scariest, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Um,
No, that's a movie that like it stuck with me. It unsettled me so much the first time that I saw it. Like there's something just the way that it's filmed, like the opening, like the opening shots of the car driving is just like, why is this is scaring me somehow. Why is this scary? What I really sort of disapprove of, about denouncing jump scares is that it implies a kind of like hierarchy of good and bad kinds of horror. It's sort of accepting the terms of all the people who don't like horror movies. You know, like that there is a proper way to make a movie, and the best horror movies are the ones that are the closest to the aesthetics and like emotional experiences of other kinds of movies. So like that's something that really interests me about horror movies, is that they just completely reject that. Like there's just something, it's not just transgressive, but at times it's almost like punk, you know, like the early punk bands fucking loved horror movies, you
yeah,
know, like there's all sorts of songs from that like first couple generation of horror movies about just like, well, about like Night of the Living Dead or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or just like whatever monster movie or whatever they happen to watch that week because they're just like weirdos who like that radical energy. And part of that radical energy is that it doesn't look or behave like other kinds of movies. And why should horror like try to fit itself into the box of like a, you know, a studio thriller that's much more proper, and like the excess is what's interesting about horror. And no other genres want to do it. So, like, why not embrace this thing that only horror does?
It's definitely a genre of excess.
Yeah, yeah, right. Like, good taste is far too overvalued, and horror movies in general are a kind of assault on good taste. But in that chapter, I talk about, like, if jump scares in horror movies are reviled, they're even more reviled in games. And, like, what's even lower than that, like YouTube prank videos and GIFs. But the thing is, they're all part of the same sort of genre ecosystem, where jump scares in, like, the 90s and early 2000s move from film to games, and it becomes like a thing that characterizes horror games. And then, like, start to be adopted by people making GIFs and YouTube videos once, like, video and image sharing sites and social networks start developing in the mid aughts. And the thing is that horror movies take note. So, like, it's this thing that, like, travels from movies to games to, stuff that most people would not consider like art in any way. um, but that they reveal new possibilities and sort of new understandings of the genre for filmmakers. um, yeah,
Yeah,
and I think that's fascinating.
I know one of my first experiences on the internet when I was too young was just look, the car changes colors as it moves behind the tree, and then jump scare. That is, I think, most a lot of people's too early of an experience. Just
That actually comes from a German TV commercial
was a
for,
coffee commercial, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, and you'd be surprised to know that it wasn't particularly beloved on television. But that a couple of years later, it finds new life being passed around on the internet. And so, like, it's it's a viral video that was created before there was the means to make it go viral. But then as soon as, like, YouTube comes along, people start passing it around.
Yeah, yeah, that's one of the best part. The fondest memories of early internet for sure is just those short jump scare videos that every kid falls for.
Yeah.
The one where it's just like you have to move your cursor through the maze, but it's like very challenging right at the end. But as soon as you hit the finish line, just jump scare.
Oh
Um,
yeah. I,
another,
I write about the maze too. Um, which, interestingly, like, so the maze itself gets passed along, but where it really sort of takes off is, again, on YouTube, where there are videos of just, like just a video of what playing it is like, oh, look at the cursor, like, this is the most difficult game ever made, or, whatever, just to get you to watch long enough to, get scared. But then a bunch of reaction videos, of, people trying to play it, and then the jump scare happens and they fall backwards out of their seat, or, like, start punching the screen, or, you know uh, like, running out of the room in a sprint or whatever. um, and, like, I think that that's sort of the same response that you get from, uh, seeing a jump scare in a movie theater. Like, that's sort of like, I'm scared, I jumped, oh, it's just fake. And it's interesting that it sort of comes at the beginning of social media, the beginning of, like, the current iteration of the internet, that it's sort of this reminder that what we're watching is just on the screen.
the horror genre is fun to say the least. Like there's some really dark stuff, some stuff I don't want to ever see again. But at the end of the day, it's my favorite genre and the one I keep going back to because there's just something fun about being scared. There's an adrenaline rush, especially even when it's like quote unquote cheap stuff. So to kind of wrap things up with just a more fun question, horror movie crossovers have been a pretty fun sort of thing. I feel like they're largely fan service. Movies like Freddy versus Jason, Alien versus Predator, Puppet Master versus Demonic Toys, and then my favorite movie title, The Ginger Dead Man versus Evil Bong. Horror monsters like to get put against each other as these sort of mascots who will win kind of thing. So just a more fun question, who is the ultimate horror monster? And if you put them all in a fight, who would win?
So I just real quick, like that's not a new phenomenon. Like
Yeah,
the monsters, like the monsters of the original Universal horror cycle, like
they'd meet up all the time. Yeah.
Dracula and Frankenstein's monster are hanging out with Abbott and Costello pretty quick, you know? Um, but I think for me, well, I mean, I think the monster that I love the most is Frankenstein's monster. But there have been so many different versions. I'm trying to think of something a, a bit less played out.
Mhm.
So let's say I know what it is. I would love to see Leatherface placed in a situation in which Leatherface is the hero. Not not that he's working for, like uh altruistic ends.
Mhm.
That's not what I mean, but like, I don't know, plop Leatherface into the middle of a Resident Evil movie or something like that, where he's fighting a bunch of zombies and creatures and all that. That that sounds fantastic to me.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much all I had. Do you have any closing thoughts? Anything to sort of wrap up?
I love that there's so much enthusiasm about horror at Pitt, and not just about the genre in general, but in engaging with it.
Mhm.
Um, that there are so many students who are making horror movies, but also who want to talk about horror movies and think about horror movies, because I think that it is an important genre,
Mhm.
because it does stuff that other genres don't do, because it talks about things that other genres don't want to talk about, um, and because it just sort of accesses different regions of the brain.
Mhm.
Um, I think that it's important to always reckon with horror, and it's fun too.